There was a bulldozer in my front yard, and a man in a neon vest was waving at me like I was lost. I blinked twice, dragging my dusty suitcase behind me, still jet-lagged from a 23-hour flight and a month-long archaeological dig in Guatemala. I wasn't hallucinating. There was caution tape strung across my driveway. A giant red sold sign towered over the lawn. The problem was, I hadn't sold my land. I hadn't even been in the country for 6 weeks. And judging by the fresh tire marks in the soil and the sound of concrete being torn up, someone had just started building a cul-de-sac on my family's ancestral property. I dropped my bag, stormed past the machinery, and nearly tackled the clipboard-wielding contractor who casually informed me the property was now part of an HOA redevelopment plan. When I told him this was my land, he laughed and said, "Not anymore." That was the exact moment I knew something was very, very wrong. My name is Daniel Becker, and my family has lived on this land for over 130 years. It's not a mansion. It's a 2-bedroom brick farmhouse with a barn, a windmill, and a stubborn rooster named Lieutenant Cluck. My grandfather fought like hell to keep it from getting swallowed up by the expanding suburbs, and when he passed, he left it to me with one rule: never sell to the HOA. And I didn't. I never would. Which made it especially strange to hear a construction foreman say the land had been sold to the HOA 2 weeks ago and was now part of Phase 3 development. I asked for documentation. He shrugged and said to talk to the HOA President. Her name was Karen Lancaster. Of course it was. I drove straight to the HOA office, which was newly renovated, air-conditioned, and filled with fake succulents and the faint smell of vanilla candles. Karen Lancaster sat behind the largest desk in the room, flanked by 2 assistants who looked like failed reality show contestants. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse just before pouncing. I told her there must have been some mistake. My land wasn't for sale. She blinked slowly, slid a file across the desk, and said the property had been vacant for over 45 days and was listed as abandoned. According to HOA bylaws, she claimed, abandoned common land could be reabsorbed and reallocated for community development. I stared at her in disbelief. My name was still on the title. The taxes were paid. The house wasn't vacant. It was locked. I had informed my neighbor and the mail service I'd be away for research. And yet, here was this smug suburban dictator with a perfectly ironed pantsuit and a fake estate smile, claiming she had the right to sell my property. She slid another paper toward me, this one with my forged signature on a sale agreement. I nearly vomited. Karen leaned back in her chair and said with practiced calm that the sale had already gone through, permits were filed, and if I had any concerns I could take it up with the county. She made a snide comment about how people who leave their property unattended shouldn't expect it to sit unused forever. I clenched my jaw, nodded once, and left before I lost it. On my way out, I snapped photos of everything, including the paperwork she so casually left on the desk. My fingers trembled as I dialed my old college buddy Felix, a former IRS investigator turned freelance forensic accountant. He didn't pick up, so I texted him, "Emergency. Need to expose a fraud." Back at my place, or what was left of it, the construction crew had already bulldozed my rose garden. They were cutting into the old irrigation system and digging holes for foundation pylons. My barn door was swinging open like someone had forced it, and one of the windows was cracked. I found a surveyor's stake marked HOA land hammered into the soil near the windmill. My windmill. The same one I spent a summer restoring with my grandfather when I was 13. I took a deep breath and tried not to scream. Instead, I went inside and looked for my deed. It was missing. The lockbox where I kept my property documents had been opened. Nothing else was touched. No signs of forced entry. No mess. Just the folder containing my title papers gone. I felt cold all over. Either someone had broken in very carefully or someone with access had taken it. I drove over to my neighbor Nora's house and asked if she had seen anyone near my place. She frowned and told me a woman matching Karen's description had come by 3 weeks ago, saying she was doing a welfare check on behalf of the HOA. She even had a key. That was when I realized Karen had copied my spare key. Later that night, Felix finally called back. I explained the situation, every detail, and he listened quietly. Then he asked me to send him any photos or digital records I had. Within 24 hours, he called back and said, this wasn't just property theft. This was financial fraud on a community level. He had found traces of shell companies connected to HOA funds, all linked back to the same name, Karen Lancaster. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she had pulled something like this. In 2 other neighborhoods, similar reports had been filed but dropped mysteriously before making it to court. The reason? Settlements sealed by non-disclosure agreement. But Felix wasn't one to back down. He sent me a list of Karen's known assets, including her rental properties, a vacation cabin in Aspen, and a fishing boat registered under her husband's name. Then he said the magic words. If she touched 1 cent of HOA money to orchestrate this fake sale, we can freeze everything. The next day, I went to the county clerk's office and filed a preliminary injunction to halt any further construction, citing property dispute. I had to pay out of pocket, but it was worth it. I also began the process of formally contesting the deed transfer. Meanwhile, Felix drafted a letter to the state attorney general's office, including the first batch of evidence. I walked back into the HOA office that afternoon, handed Karen a copy of the injunction, and told her she'd better start looking for a lawyer. She smiled again, but this time her eyes twitched. I told her we were just getting started. And in the back of my mind, I knew one thing for sure: she messed with the wrong archaeologist. Because if there's one thing I know how to do, it's dig, and I was about to dig up every skeleton in her closet. It was just after sunrise when I stood at the edge of my lot, boots sinking into the muddy trench the crew had carved across what used to be my garden. The injunction had stopped construction, but the damage was already done. My irrigation lines were cut, the rose bushes that my grandmother planted were churned into mulch, and the barn's side panel looked like it had been scraped by a backhoe. It wasn't just vandalism, it was erasure. Karen hadn't just tried to steal my land, she tried to rewrite my family's story like it had never existed. But she'd made one critical mistake. She underestimated how stubborn I could be, especially when cornered. And that's exactly what I was now. A cornered man with nothing to lose and a friend who hunted white-collar criminals for fun. Felix didn't just look into bank accounts. He looked into people's habits, their weak spots, the places they got careless. And Karen Lancaster? She was careless in all the worst ways. Within 48 hours, Felix had accessed public and semi-public financial disclosures, board minutes, tax-exempt filings, and a few HOA vendor contracts that reeked of self-dealing. There were charges labeled property preservation, filed under fake addresses. One recurring name stood out: Elwood Maintenance Services. The company supposedly handled lawn and tree trimming for vacant lot. But the address linked to a UPS drop box, and the account tied directly back to a business credit card registered under Karen's maiden name. The real kicker came when Felix found the grant. Apparently, the HOA had received a modest sustainability grant from a state development fund. The grant had a stipulation: the land in question had to be owned outright by the HOA. That's when it all clicked. Karen needed my property to qualify for the payout. She'd created a paper trail that made it look like my land was abandoned, forged a sale, processed it through a straw buyer, and filed the ownership transfer just days before the grant application was finalized. She probably assumed I'd come back too late or wouldn't have the resources to fight back. That mistake was going to cost her everything. I returned to the county office to request access to title transfer document. There were 5 folders in total, each rubber-banded and stacked neatly. As I skimmed through them, I noticed something odd. My signature was on the deed sale form, but it wasn't mine. At first glance, it looked convincing. But there were small giveaways. I don't cross my Z like that. And I never sign with a trailing loop. It was a forgery. I called Felix immediately and sent him high-resolution scans. Less than an hour later, he responded with a side-by-side comparison of 3 other HOA property donation forms he'd found in public archive. All 3 had identical loops, identical ink stroke patterns, and all supposedly signed by different people. It was a copy-paste signature with minor digital modifications. Armed with proof of forgery, we moved on to the next step, discovering who actually bought the land. The county record showed a cash buyer, listed as Silver Creek Ventures LLC. But the LLC was a shell. No website. No public-facing officer. Felix dug deeper. Eventually, he found a payment trail, a wire transfer from a personal bank account to the LLC's funding account. The sender? Andrew Lancaster, Karen's nephew, a 27-year-old self-proclaimed entrepreneur whose startup history involved 3 failed apps and a drop-shipping scam. He had no visible assets, no income history, and suddenly, he was purchasing land in the suburbs? That was more than suspicious, it was incriminating. I kept the findings quiet while Felix filed paperwork to request a temporary financial hold on any HOA-linked bank accounts associated with property development reimbursement. That wasn't enough on its own, so I went one step further. I contacted a real estate attorney named Camille Wyatt. She was known in local circles for being both brilliant and ruthless, a mix of Southern charm and legal venom. After reviewing the files, she agreed to take the case. Her first action? File a civil suit for fraudulent property transfer, constructive trespass, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But her second move was even better. She filed an ex parte emergency motion to freeze Karen's assets, pending resolution of the fraud investigation. Meanwhile, I returned to my property and saw Karen standing across the road. She was dressed like she was going to brunch, sun hat, sunglasses, designer bag slung over her shoulder. She waved at me like we were neighbors who'd simply disagreed on where to put the fence. I didn't wave back. She crossed over and called out that she hoped I wasn't making too big a fuss, and that things like this were usually solved amicably. I asked her why she forged my signature. Her smile faltered for half a second before she replied, "That's a serious accusation, Daniel. You might want to be careful with your words." I told her I had photographic evidence, county file copies, and a lawyer with a frozen assets order. I told her she had 72 hours to return everything, admit fault, and resign from the HOA before we escalated it into criminal court. She stood there for a moment, looking around like the world had shifted without her permission. Then she scoffed, said I wouldn't win, and walked off as if her world hadn't just started collapsing. But that same day, the first blow landed. Karen's personal accounts, checking, savings, and her rental property fund were frozen under court order. She tried to call the bank, but they wouldn't even let her log in. Her husband, unaware of the whole thing, tried to use his debit card at a gas station and got declined. Word spread fast. By the next morning, rumors had reached the HOA board. One board member, a retired dentist named Harold, stopped by my property and sheepishly admitted he'd been pressured into voting on the development plan without reading the documents. He said Karen had promised the project would bring economic value to the community and revitalize underutilized land. He looked mortified when I showed him the photos of my destroyed barn and the forged deed. As more details surfaced, other board members began distancing themselves from Karen. One even leaked a recording of a closed-door HOA meeting in which Karen could be heard saying, "The guy's off in a jungle somewhere, he won't even notice." That audio, combined with Felix's financial evidence and the deed forgery, painted a crystal-clear picture. This wasn't a mistake. This was premeditated fraud carried out by someone who believed she was untouchable. Felix called again that evening with even more news. He'd tracked a payment from the HOA's Community Development Fund that had gone to a vendor labeled as landscaping services for Phase 3. But that vendor, Green Hollow Landscaping, didn't exist. Its registered agent? Also Karen's nephew, Andrew. Felix was assembling all the evidence into a formal packet for the State Fraud Division. He said we were close, very close, to moving beyond civil claims into criminal referral territory. That night, I sat on the edge of my demolished garden with a camping lantern and a notebook, listing everything Karen had destroyed, physically and financially. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about restoration. This land meant something. Not just to me, but to the generations before me who worked it, protected it, and passed it down with love and sweat and history. I wasn't going to let a fraudulent HOA tyrant erase all that for a check and a grant. By the end of the week, Camille called to say the court date was set. Karen would have to appear and answer for every forged signature, every fake invoice, and every illegal transfer. The best part? It would all be public. And Karen Lancaster, queen of the HOA, was about to get dragged through the mud she thought she owned. The courthouse steps echoed beneath my boots as I walked up the marble stairs, flanked by Camille on one side and Felix on the other. The weight of the last 2 weeks hung heavily on my shoulders, but I also felt something else, something I hadn't let myself feel since the day I returned to find bulldozers on my land. It was momentum. This wasn't just some petty dispute anymore. This was a full-blown reckoning. Karen Lancaster had run her little suburban empire unchecked for years, but today she had to show up in front of a judge and explain why half her assets were frozen, why her nephew had funneled property money through shell companies, and why my signature had miraculously appeared on a deed I never signed. And she couldn't smile her way out of this. The courtroom was modest. High ceilings, muted wood panels, and a single bailiff standing like a bored scarecrow near the door. But the tension in the air was razor-sharp. Karen entered 10 minutes late, wearing a beige power suit and oversized sunglasses like she thought she was walking onto a talk show set. Her attorney, a smug man with slicked-back hair and the kind of voice that sounded like it practiced its own lines in the mirror, introduced himself as Charles Denton. He oozed arrogance. When he passed me on the way to the bench, he even winked like this was all a game. I hoped he enjoyed the first 5 minutes, because the rest of the day was about to make him regret taking this case. Judge Bramley, an older man with a low voice and a reputation for zero tolerance on property fraud, called the session to order. Camille wasted no time. She laid out our evidence with surgical precision, starting with the forged deed, then the fake vendor accounts, and finally the payments traced directly to Karen's family. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as she played the leaked HOA recording where Karen's voice casually dismissed my property as empty land no one would miss. Then Camille introduced Felix, who stepped up with a flash drive and calmly walked the court through a visual timeline of every illegal transaction, every dollar misused, and every document manipulated under Karen's tenure. It was the kind of presentation that didn't just prove motive, it proved conspiracy. Charles tried to interrupt, objecting that some of the evidence was circumstantial and potentially prejudicial. The judge overruled him almost instantly. Then Karen took the stand. She sat up straight, chin high, and claimed that she acted in the best interest of the HOA and had received verbal confirmation that the property in question was unclaimed. Camille handed her a photo of the deed with my name and date clearly marked. Karen faltered but insisted the signature looked authentic. That was when Camille brought out the kicker, an affidavit from a handwriting expert confirming the signature was not only forged, but identical in pattern to 2 other fraudulent transfers linked to the HOA. Karen's mouth tightened. She looked toward Charles, who tried to call for a recess, but the judge denied it. Camille pressed harder. Why was Karen's nephew purchasing property through an LLC tied to a fake landscaping business? Why did those funds cycle back into Karen's husband's account weeks later? Karen stammered, said she wasn't personally involved in that level of detail. Then Camille pulled out another document, an email signed by Karen authorizing the grant application that claimed the HOA owned the land outright. Judge Bramley asked one question. Were you aware, at any point, that the land in question had an active title and was not listed as abandoned by the county? Karen hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room. Then, softly, she said, I don't recall. It was the wrong answer. The judge nodded grimly and ordered a full investigation into the HOA's financial practices under Karen's leadership. He upheld the asset freeze and extended it to include all secondary accounts linked to Karen's family. Camille sat back in her chair, cool and composed. I, on the other hand, had to grip the bench to keep from grinning. Outside the courtroom, reporters were waiting. Someone had tipped them off. Karen tried to rush past, shielding her face, but microphones caught her anyway. One local journalist even quoted the judge's words. If proven, this constitutes gross mismanagement and possible criminal conspiracy. I didn't stop to talk. I wasn't here for fame or revenge. I just wanted my land back. And justice. Both were now within reach. That night, the phone at my farmhouse rang non-stop. Other HOA members, neighbors, residents, even past board members, called to share their own stories. One woman named Rita told me Karen had fined her $704 unapproved shutters, and then offered to waive the fee if she donated her side yard to the HOA's park expansion. Another couple said they'd been harassed into selling their plot next to the clubhouse. Patterns were emerging. Karen had been doing this for years. My case just happened to be the one that finally blew the lid off it. The following week, Felix uncovered something huge. A series of emails from Karen's HOA email address to a developer named Mason Huxley. The tone of the messages was casual, almost flirtatious, but the contents were damning. Karen promised to clear the deed clutter and ensure full transfer authority, in exchange for a partnership share in a private housing development plan for the area. She even included pricing projections for subdivided lots on my land. It was all there in writing. Camille forwarded the messages to the district attorney. 2 days later, I received a notice. The DA's office had opened a criminal fraud investigation into Karen Lancaster and her nephew, Andrew. They would be served with subpoenas and were officially under audit. The news spread like wildfire. HOA members demanded a special meeting. They wanted Karen out. When she showed up to that meeting, she was met with cold silence. Someone had spray-painted the words liar and thief on the community clubhouse gate. A petition circulated to remove her from office permanently. The same people who once nodded politely at her in yoga class now avoided her like a virus. Despite all of that, Karen didn't go quietly. She tried to file a countersuit, claiming emotional harassment and character defamation. It didn't even make it past review. Her assets remained frozen. Her husband filed for separation and moved out of their house. The HOA board voted 8-0 to suspend her. She walked out of the meeting with her head down, no sunglasses this time, just a plain cardigan and a paper folder clutched like a lifeline. For me, the victory wasn't just legal. It was personal. I stood on my land again with peace in my chest, knowing that the system, however slow and flawed, had actually worked this time. But I also knew we weren't done. Not yet. Camille was preparing the final filings to recover damages, and the judge was pushing to schedule a formal restitution hearing. Karen might have been removed, but I wasn't walking away without ensuring every dollar she stole was clawed back and every broken law was answered for. Felix had one more lead he wanted to pursue, something about backdoor payments to a zoning official, and I had no doubt he'd find it. I looked out across my field that evening, the one Karen had tried to parcel up like it was hers to give away. The windmill creaked in the distance, and the sky glowed orange with a quiet sunset. This was my land. It always had been. And no signature on a fake deed, no smug HOA tyrant, no paper-pushing fraud could ever change that. The irony wasn't lost on me when I saw Karen's face plastered across the local news station with the headline, HOA President under criminal investigation for land fraud. She had spent years controlling the narrative in our neighborhood, deciding which flowers were acceptable, which fences were too high, who could paint their shutters what color, and now she couldn't control a single sentence of her own story. I didn't gloat. That wasn't my style. But I also wasn't about to pretend I didn't feel some satisfaction watching her stumble off the pedestal she built with threats, fines, and falsified HOA vote. The problem, though, was that Karen wasn't finished. No, Karen was the kind of person who would rather light the house on fire than let someone else take the keys. And it turned out she had a few matches left. The first sign came 3 days after her suspension. My front gate had been left open in the middle of the night. I never left it unlocked. The next morning, I found tire tracks across the west edge of my property. Deep ones. Like someone had driven in circles deliberately to tear up the soil. At first, I thought it was just petty vandalism. Maybe some misguided supporter of hers acting out. But then I checked the security camera mounted on my barn. The feed had been cut. The cable had been severed cleanly, not yanked or chewed, cut with precision. Karen had been quiet, too quiet, and now I was starting to see why. Felix ran the footage from before the cut and caught a blurry shot of a figure in a hoodie tampering with the wiring. The car parked down the road had a partial plate that matched one registered to Karen's nephew, Andrew. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough for Camille to file a notice of continued harassment and tampering, which the judge added to the existing investigation. Still, we couldn't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I had a gut feeling Karen was testing the water, trying to see how far she could go without getting caught outright. Then came the fire. Not a big one, but it was enough. I smelled smoke around 5 a.m. and stepped outside to find a smoldering patch of scorched grass along my east fence line. Someone had poured accelerant. That wasn't a prank. That was a threat. I called the fire department and the sheriff. Both were on scene within half an hour. The fire chief was an old friend of my father's, and when he saw the scene, he didn't mince words. This was arson. The sheriff agreed. Karen wasn't just retaliating. She was escalating. Felix said it best that afternoon over the phone. People like Karen don't lose quietly. They scramble, sabotage, and spin. And they try to rewrite the ending. But I wasn't about to let her write a single page more. So I made the next move. We leaked everything. Camille organized a carefully curated information packet and sent it anonymously to a local journalist with a history of exposing corruption. Within 48 hours, the story hit every regional news outlet. It included audio clips of Karen's voice promising kickbacks to a developer, screenshots of emails, and even highlighted portions of the HOA bylaws she had manipulated for personal gain. The fallout was immediate. Homeowners flooded the HOA office with calls. Some demanded refunds. Others threatened lawsuit. The board members who had once sat quietly beside her scrambled to clear their names. A few even offered to testify in exchange for leniency. Karen, predictably, blamed everyone else. She held a small press conference outside her home, flanked by her nephew and a few diehard supporters, and claimed she was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled landowner with a personal vendetta. That part made me laugh. Because if protecting the home my grandfather built made me disgruntled, then I'd wear the title proudly. But her real misstep came a week later, when she submitted forged meeting notes to the court claiming the HOA board had authorized the land transaction months before I left town. She even produced a fake vote tally. Camille's paralegal spotted the manipulation instantly. The document metadata showed it had been created just days earlier. Worse, one of the supposed yes voters had moved out of state over a year ago. The judge was furious. He added obstruction of justice to the list of charges under review. Karen was unraveling, and the rope she was swinging from was one she'd woven herself. Around this time, a face from the past came back into the picture. Sheriff Nolan. He had retired 3 years ago but returned part-time for investigations. Karen had once tried to get him removed from his post because he refused to issue citations for minor HOA code violations she kept filing. Turns out, he still held a grudge. When he heard about the fire and the forged documents, he offered to assist in reviewing her history. Within days, he uncovered 2 more cases of property tampering and evidence that Karen had improperly used HOA funds to pay off legal threats in the past. It all led to a growing file the DA's office was calling the Lancaster Ledger, a comprehensive trail of entitlement, fraud, and power abuse. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on rebuilding. I hired a contractor to restore my fence line and help regrade the torn-up patches near the barn. I used temporary cameras and solar-powered floodlights to monitor every inch of the perimeter. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. But if Karen thought I was going to roll over or leave town, she clearly never met a Becker. We've got roots deeper than any HOA permit can touch. Then something unexpected happened. A group of residents from the HOA showed up at my property. Doctors, teachers, young families, even retirees. They brought cookies, coffee, and apologies. They said they had no idea how bad it had gotten under Karen's control. One woman said she'd been too afraid to speak up when Karen threatened to fine her for planting an unapproved tree. Another man revealed that Karen once tried to revoke his mailbox access because he was late paying a $25 fine. The stories poured out like floodwater, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was fighting this alone. They asked if I'd consider joining the new HOA board once Karen was formally removed. I told them I'd consider it, but only under one condition: that every rule and regulation was publicly reviewed and rewritten with community input. No secret vote. No unchecked fines. No more fear. They agreed without hesitation. Karen's world continued to shrink. Her social media disappeared. Her husband filed for divorce. Her house went up for sale, but no buyers showed up once the full criminal docket was made public. And when the news broke that the DA intended to pursue felony charges including wire fraud, real estate fraud, and obstruction, Karen vanished from public view entirely. Her nephew tried to run damage control but ended up getting arrested for tax evasion tied to the fake landscaping company. The final blow didn't come from me. It came from the people she had once ruled over with smug little newsletters and HOA violation slip. At a special assembly, the board voted unanimously to ban Karen Lancaster from holding any future community office in the state. Her name would appear on the registry of barred HOA officials. Her entire little kingdom had crumbled. I stood alone that evening by my windmill, the breeze cutting soft across the land. The earth smelled like it used to, clean, grounded, honest. There were no backhoes or neon-vested men. No caution tape. Just peace and the quiet knowledge that some people dig holes so deep for others that they forget how close they are to falling in themselves. Karen tried to bury me in paperwork and fake signatures. Instead, she buried her own legacy. The courtroom was packed tighter than it had ever been. Reporters lined the benches like vultures with notepads, some whispering into their microphones as they updated their live feed. Curious neighbors who once avoided eye contact now leaned in, eager to watch Karen Lancaster's final act play out in public. There were no sunglasses this time, no designer suit or smug smile. Karen entered in a wrinkled blouse, her hair pulled into a tight knot, eyes puffy, mouth tense. Her lawyer looked like a man who regretted every billable hour he'd spent defending her. As for me, I sat calmly beside Camille, arms crossed, expression steady. This was the moment I'd waited for, not out of vengeance, but out of principle. She had taken my land, lied to my face, burned my soil, and tried to erase my family's legacy. And now the gavel was about to drop. Judge Bramley read through the findings slowly, carefully, like a man carving each word into stone. Fraudulent transfer of property. Falsification of official HOA record. Embezzlement through shell vendors. Obstruction of justice. Attempted arson, though not enough physical evidence tied Karen directly to the fire, the suspicion alone was damning. When the verdict came, it landed like a stone dropped in water. Guilty on all primary counts. She was ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $1.42 million, funds to be extracted through the sale of her properties, liquidated assets, and pending income claims. But it didn't stop there. The court also ordered a complete forensic audit of the HOA's past 5 years, freezing any payouts to board members during the review. Karen stood there without a word, absorbing the weight of her self-made collapse. Camille leaned over and whispered that we could begin proceedings for the civil suit now. I nodded, still watching Karen as she slowly sat down, clearly unaccustomed to a courtroom where she wasn't calling the shots. She looked older, like the months of scheming and unraveling had carved permanent lines across her face. But I didn't feel pity. She hadn't just broken rules, she'd broken people. Families intimidated out of their homes. Elderly couples forced to pay fines for imaginary violations. Neighbors humiliated at public meetings. What I went through was just one chapter in a book full of silent suffering. That book was now being rewritten. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Microphones aimed like rifles, cameras flashing, questions flying. But they weren't for me. They were for the people. The residents. The board members who'd finally stood up and voted her out. The man who'd spent 3 years too afraid to speak. The woman whose flower beds were torn up for violating visual cohesion. They all had stories now, and the press wanted every page. I walked quietly to my truck, Felix trailing beside me with a satisfied smirk. Camille stayed behind to handle reporters. We didn't need the spotlight, we had the result. The next week was a whirlwind. Karen's primary home was seized by court order, listed for auction. Her husband filed official paperwork severing financial ties. Her nephew, Andrew, was indicted separately for tax fraud and attempted wire fraud, and the IRS placed a lien on his account. The HOA's official financial records were turned over to a third-party forensic team, which quickly discovered over $400,000 in unexplained expenses over the past 4 years. Refund checks began arriving in mailboxes for residents who had been fined under false pretense. Some were as small as $75. Others were thousands. One elderly couple received $9,200 in overpaid violations, and broke down in tears right at the post office. But what mattered most to me was that my land, every square foot of it, was restored. The court not only nullified the fraudulent transfer, but designated the property a historic preservation site under a rarely invoked ordinance that protected legacy farmland over 50 years old. That meant no more HOA encroachment, no more development loopholes, and no more surprise bulldozers. The plaque arrived 2 weeks later, a simple bronze rectangle engraved with the words Becker Homestead, established 1892. I mounted it on the windmill base, exactly where my grandfather would have wanted it. Felix, ever the investigator, didn't stop there. He'd grown oddly attached to the case, and began writing an exposé about HOA corruption, using Karen's story as a blueprint. He even got invited to speak at a city council meeting on the dangers of unchecked HOA power. I sat in the back that evening, listening as he laid out the map of fraud Karen had left behind, and watched as city officials finally began drafting a proposal for tighter oversight and public accountability standards for homeowner associations across the county. It was a ripple effect I hadn't expected, but it felt like the kind of legacy that mattered. Camille, always 2 steps ahead, filed the final round of civil claims. Since Karen's criminal verdict had been ruled in our favor, the civil trial was little more than a formality. She didn't even contest it. We were awarded punitive damages and attorney fees, which meant not only did I recover the cost of the damage to my land and legal expenses, but I also received an additional settlement meant to deter similar actions from future HOA officials. It wasn't about the money, but I won't lie, it felt good watching a system that usually favored bureaucracy finally side with the people it was meant to protect. As the weeks passed, life returned to something close to normal. I repaired the barn door, rebuilt the garden fence, even replaced the old irrigation lines with a modern system my grandfather would have called sorcery. Lieutenant Cluck resumed his post on the fence rail like he hadn't missed a beat, and I spent most mornings sipping coffee on the porch, listening to the soft hum of the windmill turning overhead. The land was whole again. Not just physically but spiritually. It no longer carried the weight of someone else's greed pressing into its soil. The HOA board was gutted, reformed under an interim panel made up of residents who had never held office before. They were humble, eager to do things right. They reached out and asked if I would consider helping with policy reform. At first, I declined. I'd had enough meetings, courtrooms, and fine print to last a lifetime. But after some thought, I agreed, under one condition. Every change would be voted on publicly. No closed-door meetings. No ambiguous language. And every resident would receive a hard copy of the new bylaws. If I was going to help, it was going to be on my terms. They agreed. On the 6-month anniversary of the trial, the town held a community fair on the green space across from the courthouse. For the first time in years, people laughed without looking over their shoulder. Kids painted signs that read, "Our HOA, our rules," and handed out lemonade. One of the booths was set up with photos of community members who had helped expose the corruption. Someone had snuck my photo in there. I tried to act annoyed, but secretly, it meant the world to me. It wasn't about recognition, it was about being part of something that finally stood up to power and said, "No more." That night, I walked the edge of my property with a flashlight in hand and a warm breeze brushing through the tall grass. I paused beneath the windmill and looked up at the plaque again, its bronze face glinting under the moonlight. Everything Karen had tried to destroy was still standing. The house, the barn, the windmill, the legacy. She had brought fire and forged paper and bulldozers and lies. But I had brought patience, truth, and a whole town that finally woke up and said, enough. Some battles don't end with explosions or declarations. Some just fade into quiet nights where peace returns and the land breathes easy again. And in that silence you remember who you are, not because you yelled the loudest, but because you refused to be erased. And because sometimes holding your ground is the most powerful move of all.